Before we begin, if you want the full continuation of these stories, more uncensored 18-plus Ancient BL content, extended scenes, and unlimited royal forbidden romance, you can join us on Patreon at SpicyAncientBL. YouTube does not allow us to show or monetize everything freely here, so the deeper and more intense versions are waiting for you there. You can find the link in the description and pinned comment. Jin Yue died with the taste of ash in his mouth and the weight of a shattered empire on his shoulders. The flames consuming the imperial palace were blinding, but they weren't what he was looking at. As the wooden beams of the throne room collapsed around him, Jin Yue simply stared at the empty stone steps leading up to his golden chair. He was the emperor, the ruler of the vast Liang dynasty, and he was dying completely, utterly alone. But the smoke filling his lungs wasn't what was suffocating him. It was a memory of a cup of poisoned wine, a cold winter morning, and the only man who had ever truly loved him, Commander Tian Ze, the head of the Imperial Shadow Guards. The man Jin Yue had commanded to drink poison. Back then, Jin Yue had believed the whispers. He was a young, terrified puppet emperor, surrounded by manipulative ministers and a cruel empress dowager. They had told him Tian Ze was plotting a rebellion. They had shown him forged letters. They had convinced him that the tall, silent commander who stood by his door every night was waiting for the perfect moment to slit his throat. So, Jin Yue had summoned him. He handed him the cup. He remembered Tian Ze kneeling. The commander didn't beg. He didn't draw his sword. He just looked at the poisoned wine, and then he looked up at Jin Yue. "Is this what your majesty truly desires?" Tian Ze had asked. His voice was deep, steady, completely devoid of fear. Jin Yue had trembled, but he nodded. Tian Ze hadn't hesitated. He drank it, and as the poison stopped his heart, he had smiled. A gentle, heartbreaking smile that Jin Yue had never seen before. It wasn't until 3 years later that Jin Yue discovered the truth. The letters were fake. The rebellion was a lie. Tian Ze had spent his entire life protecting Jin Yue from the shadows, hoarding away the emperor's enemies, taking blades meant for him, and Jin Yue had rewarded him with death. When the real rebellion came, led by the crown prince's surviving faction, Jin Yue had no one left to defend him. As the flames finally reached the throne, Jin Yue closed his eyes. A single tear slipped down his soot-stained cheek. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty, burning room. "Tian Ze, I'm so sorry." The fire roared. Darkness swallowed him. And then he took a breath. A sharp, painful, freezing breath. Jin Yue's eyes snapped open. He expected the afterlife. He expected hellfire. What he did not expect was the peeling paint of the ceiling in the cold palace. He lay frozen on a hard, wooden bed. Blink, blink, blink. He sat up so fast his vision swam. The air was freezing. The scent of cheap, stale sandalwood incense filled the room. The thin silk blanket sliding off his chest was faded. "No," he choked out. The sound of his own voice startled him. It wasn't the deep, exhausted voice of a ruined 25-year-old emperor. It was lighter, younger. He threw himself off the bed, stumbling over his own bare feet, and crashed into a bronze mirror sitting on a dusty table. He stared at the reflection. Soft features, unblemished skin, hair tied back with a simple, unadorned ribbon. He was 20 years old. He was still the despised 7th prince, living in the neglected corner of the palace. He had gone back, 5 years before the fire, 5 years before he took the throne. 4 years before he handed Tian Ze that cup of wine. The door creaked open, and a young eunuch walked in carrying a basin of water. "Your Highness, you're awake. The weather is terribly cold today. I brought—" Jin Yue grabbed the boy by the collar. Water sloshed onto the floor. "Where is he?" Jin Yue demanded, his voice bordering on hysterical. The eunuch looked terrified. Who, Your Highness?" "Tian Ze. Where is Commander Tian Ze?" The commander of the Shadow Guards?" "Your Highness, why would you ask about him? He is inspecting the royal training grounds today." Jin Yue didn't hear the rest. He dropped the eunuch and bolted out the door. "Your Highness, you have no shoes on. You aren't wearing your outer robe." Jin Yue didn't care. The freezing winter mud seeped into his socks. The biting wind sliced through his thin inner garments. The palace corridors were a maze, but his feet remembered the way. He was running like a madman. Court ladies shrieked and dropped their baskets as he sprinted past. Royal guards stared in utter bewilderment as the usually timid, invisible 7th prince tore through the imperial courtyards like a demon was chasing him. He reached the training grounds, his chest heaving, his lungs burning. Dozens of elite guards were sparring in the dirt, but Jin Yue only saw one person. Standing by the weapon racks, reviewing a ledger, was Tian Ze. He was 28 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the dark crimson and black uniform of the Imperial Guard. His jaw was sharp, his expression serious, his dark eyes focused on the scroll in his hands. He was alive, he was breathing, he was whole. Jin Yue's knees buckled. He didn't care about his dignity, he didn't care about the staring soldiers. He walked straight into the center of the training ground. Tian Ze looked up. His sharp eyes narrowed slightly as he saw a barefoot, freezing prince marching toward him. He handed the ledger to a subordinate and stepped forward, bowing perfectly. "Seventh Prince, you are improperly dressed for this weather. Is there an emerge?" Jin Yue crashed into him. He wrapped his arms around the commander's waist and buried his face in Tian Ze's chest. The entire training ground fell dead silent. You could have heard a snowflake hit the ground. Tian Ze froze. The most lethal man in the Empire, a man who had killed assassins with his bare hands, stood completely paralyzed, his arms hovering awkwardly in the air. "Your Highness?" Tian Ze's deep voice held a dangerous edge of confusion. Jin Yue was shaking. The warmth radiating from Tian Ze's armor was real. The heartbeat drumming against his cheek was real. He gripped the commander's dark robe so tightly his knuckles turned white, terrified that if he let go, the man would turn to ash. "You're alive," Jin Yue whispered into his chest. Tian Ze blinked. The guards blinked. Jin Yue realized, entirely too late, that he was acting like an absolute lunatic. He slowly pulled back, looking up at Tian Ze's bewildered, stoic face. He needed an excuse. A brilliant, undeniable excuse for why a prince had just sprinted across the palace to hug a terrifying commander. Jin Yue cleared his throat. He pointed a trembling finger at Tian Ze's waist. "Your sword knot," Jin Yue blurted out. "It's frayed. I came to tell you to get a new one." Tian Ze stared at him. He looked down at his perfectly intact, pristine sword knot. Then he looked back at the barefoot, shivering prince. "I will keep that in mind, Your Highness." Jin Yue wanted to throw himself into the palace moat. His second life was off to a spectacular start. The next morning, the emperor received a strange petition. The seventh prince, who usually avoided his father like the plague, begged on his knees for a personal shadow guard, and he specifically requested Commander Tian Ze. The emperor, amused by this sudden burst of bravery from his most useless son, agreed. For Tian Ze, it was a demotion. Going from guarding the emperor's secrets to babysitting a neglected prince in the cold palace was an insult. But Tian Ze packed his meager belongings and reported to Jin Yue's quarters without a single complaint, because that was who Tian Ze was, loyal to a fault. When Tian Ze walked into the small, drafty courtyard, Jin Yue was waiting for him. "Commander," Jin Yue said, trying to sound regal and failing, mostly because he couldn't stop staring at Tian Ze's face. "Your Highness," Tian Ze bowed low. "I am yours to command." Those words sent a sharp spike of pain through Jin Yue's heart. "I am yours to command." In his past life, Jin Yue had commanded him to die. "Your first command," Jin Yue said, his voice softening, "is to sit down and drink tea with me." Tian Ze frowned. "Guards do not sit with princes, Your Highness. This prince commands it." Tian Ze hesitated, then stiffly sat on the edge of the wooden stool, keeping his back entirely straight, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Jin Yue poured the tea himself and pushed the cup across the table. Thus began the most confusing period of Tian Ze's life. From the outside, it looked like the seventh prince had lost his mind. From Tian Ze's perspective, his new master was dangerously unpredictable. Jin Yue refused to let Tian Ze stand in the cold. If it rained, Jin Yue dragged him inside. If the palace kitchens sent terrible food, Jin Yue gave Tian Ze his own portions. During the night, when Tian Ze was supposed to stand guard outside the bedroom door, Jin Yue would casually leave the door wide open. "I'm scared of the dark," Jin Yue lied smoothly. "Bring a chair inside." Tian Ze brought a chair inside. He sat in the corner of the room, blending into the shadows. "You're too far," Jin Yue said from the bed, wrapped in blankets. Tian Ze moved his chair exactly 1 inch forward. "Still too far. Move closer. What if an assassin comes through the window? By the time you cross the room, I'll be dead." Tian Ze sighed silently, picking up the heavy wooden chair and placing it right next to the bed. Jin Yue turned on his side, resting his head on his hand, just watching the commander in the dim candlelight. Tian Ze's profile was sharp, beautiful in a rugged, untouchable way. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't cold. "Commander," Jin Yue whispered. "Your Highness, why do you never look at me when we talk?" Tian Ze kept his eyes firmly fixed on the opposite wall. "It is disrespectful to stare at royalty." "I permit it," Jin Yue said softly. Tian Ze didn't move for a long time. Then, very slowly, he turned his head. His dark eyes met Jin Yue's. In that moment, the air in the room shifted. The playful teasing vanished. Underneath Tian Ze's rigid discipline, there was a quiet, intense fire. The way he looked at Jin Yue wasn't just a guard looking at a master. It was deep, searching, almost hungry, though heavily restrained. Jin Yue's heart skipped a beat. He remembered that look. He had seen it right before Tian Ze drank the poison. It was the look of a man who was quietly, hopelessly in love, but knew he could never speak a word of it. Jin Yue's breath hitched. He reached out from under the blankets. His fingertips brushed against the rough fabric of Tian Ze's sleeve. Tian Ze's entire body tensed. His breathing turned shallow. He looked down at the pale hand touching his arm, then back up to Jin Yue's eyes. Neither of them spoke. The candlelight flickered, casting shadows over them. Jin Yue let his fingers linger for just a second longer than was appropriate, before slowly pulling back. "Good night, Tian Ze," he murmured. "Good night, Your Highness." Tian Ze's voice was noticeably rougher than usual. Months passed, and winter faded into a tense, humid summer. Jin Yue's presence at the imperial court began to grow. In his past life, he had hidden in the shadows, letting others manipulate him. This time, he began carefully building alliances. He played the fool when necessary, but behind closed doors, he was calculating. And Tian Ze watched it all. He watched the trembling barefoot prince turn into a sharp-minded tactician. He watched Jin Yue dismantle a corrupt minister's career with a few well-placed rumors. He realized that Jin Yue wasn't a fragile rabbit, he was a sleeping dragon. And strangely, the only time that dragon was soft, the only time his guard dropped completely, was when he was alone with Tian Ze. But palace politics wait for no one. The crown prince, Jin Yue's older brother, began to notice the seventh prince's growing confidence, and the crown prince despised competition. It happened at the summer banquet. The imperial gardens were filled with silk banners, musicians, and lavish food. Jin Yue sat at his assigned table, sipping wine, while Tian Ze stood rigidly behind him, a silent shadow. The crown prince, flushed with alcohol, stumbled over to Jin Yue's table, holding a massive goblet of wine. "Seventh brother," the crown prince slurred loudly, drawing the attention of the surrounding nobles. "You've been so arrogant lately. Do you think a few clever words make you worthy of our father's favor?" Jin Yue smiled politely. "I wouldn't dare, royal brother." The crown prince sneered. He looked past Jin Yue and locked eyes on Tian Ze. "And you even took my father's best dog," the crown prince laughed mockingly. "Commander Tian Ze, you went from guarding the emperor to guarding a piece of trash. Tell me, does he make you sleep at the foot of his bed like a real dog?" The court fell silent. Nobles whispered behind their sleeves. Tian Ze's expression didn't change. His face was carved from stone. He was used to insults. He was a weapon, and weapons didn't have feelings. But Jin Yue did. A cold, murderous fury erupted in Jin Yue's chest. The guilt, the trauma, the absolute devotion he felt for the man standing behind him flared into a dangerous inferno. No one was allowed to disrespect Tian Ze, not in this lifetime. Jin Yue stood up. He picked up his own cup of wine, walked calmly up to the crown prince, and smoothly, deliberately, poured the entire cup over the crown prince's head. Red wine dripped down the crown prince's face, staining his expensive golden robes. The musicians stopped playing. Someone dropped a plate. Half the ministers stopped breathing. "Oh dear," Jin Yue said, his voice dripping with terrifying, absolute calm. "My hand slipped. Forgive me, royal brother. I must be drunk." The crown prince let out a roar of rage and raised his hand to strike Jin Yue across the face. Before the blow could land, a large, calloused hand caught the crown prince's wrist. It was Tian Ze. The commander had moved so fast he was a blur. His grip on the crown prince's wrist was like iron. Tian Ze's eyes, usually so empty, were dark and lethal. "The prince's hand slipped," Tian Ze said, his voice rumbling like thunder. "Do not touch him." "Let go of me, you lowly guard," the crown prince shrieked. Tian Ze shoved his arm back, stepping smoothly in front of Jin Yue, shielding him completely with his broad body. The emperor's eunuch hurried over to break up the fight, ushering the furious crown prince away, but the damage was done. The entire court had seen it. The invisible seventh prince had publicly humiliated the heir, all to defend a guard. When they returned to their quarters that night, the silence was suffocating. As soon as the door closed, Tian Ze turned around. He looked angry, truly, deeply angry. "That was foolish," Tian Ze snapped. It was the first time he had ever raised his voice at Jin Yue. "He is the crown prince. He could have you beaten. He could have you ruined. And for what? Because he insulted me? I am a guard. My honor does not matter." "It matters to me," Jin Yue shouted back, his own emotions spilling over. He stepped close to Tian Ze, entirely closing the distance between them. Don't you dare tell me your honor doesn't matter. Don't you dare act like you are just a tool to be discarded. You are worth 1,000 of him. You are worth more than this entire corrupted palace. Tian Ze stared down at him, his chest heaving. The fierce, desperate look in Jin Yue's eyes was tearing away his defenses. Why do you care so much? Tian Ze asked, his voice suddenly dropping to a raw, painful whisper. Since the day you asked for me, you look at me like you owe me your life, like you are afraid I will disappear. Why, Jin Yue? It was the first time he had used his name. Not your highness, Jin Yue. Jin Yue's breath caught. He looked up at the man he loved, the man he had killed, the man who was standing here so vibrant and alive. He couldn't tell him. I killed you. I ruined you. I am trying to fix it. Instead, Jin Yue reached up. He placed his hands flat against Tian Ze's chest, right over his armored heart. Because you are the only real thing in my life, Jin Yue whispered. Tian Ze closed his eyes, a muscle feathered in his jaw. Slowly, hesitantly, as if approaching a wild, beautiful animal, Tian Ze raised his hands. He didn't push Jin Yue away. Instead, his large hands settled on Jin Yue's waist. The touch was electric. It burned through the layers of silk. They stood there in the quiet room, the power imbalance of prince and guard completely shattered. Tian Ze pulled him just a fraction of an inch closer. Jin Yue tilted his head up. Their lips were so close he could feel the warmth of Tian Ze's breath. A heavy, sensual tension filled the space between them. Forbidden, dangerous. And if you are enjoying this forbidden royal tension, remember, the extended and uncensored 18+ continuation is available on Patreon at SpicyAncientBL. The link is in the description and pinned comment. The aftermath of that night changed everything. They never spoke of the near kiss. They didn't have to. Every glance, every accidental brush of their hands, every time Tian Ze helped Jin Yue tie his outer robes, the air cracked with unspoken desire. But the crown prince had not forgotten the humiliation. He was a petty, vicious man, and he knew that attacking Jin Yue directly was difficult now that the emperor was watching him. So, he aimed for the one thing Jin Yue clearly cared about. The autumn hunting festival arrived. The royal family traveled to the heavily forested mountains in the north. It was supposed to be a time of celebration, a display of martial prowess. Jin Yue hated it. In his past life, this was where the crown prince had arranged for a bandit attack to eliminate political rivals. Jin Yue prepared meticulously. He warned Tian Ze to stay close, refusing to let the commander out of his sight. Deep in the woods, riding on horseback, Jin Yue and Tian Ze became separated from the main hunting party. The fog rolled in thick and heavy. The sound of hunting horns faded into the distance. We should turn back, Your Highness, Tian Ze said, his hand resting on his sword. His instincts were flaring. Agreed, Jin Yue murmured, pulling his horse's reins. Then, the snap of a twig echoed through the trees. Black-clad figures dropped from the branches. Assassins, at least 20 of them. And they didn't wear bandit rags. They moved with military precision. Tian Ze drew his sword. Ride, he roared at Jin Yue. Jin Yue didn't ride. He drew the ceremonial dagger from his belt and stayed right beside Tian Ze. The clash of steel rang out. Tian Ze was a god of war. He moved with terrifying grace, his blade a blur of silver, cutting down assassin after assassin. He stayed constantly between the blades and Jin Yue, taking minor cuts to his armor to protect the prince. But there were too many. Jin Yue fought back, slashing at a man who tried to grab his horse, but his eyes never left Tian Ze. Then, he saw it. An assassin, hidden in the brush, raising a heavy military crossbow. The bolt was aimed directly at Tian Ze's unprotected back. Time stopped. The memory overlaid reality. Tian Ze, drinking the poison. Tian Ze, falling to the floor. Tian Ze, dying. No! Jin Yue screamed. He didn't think. He threw himself off his horse, launching his body directly into Tian Ze's back just as the crossbow fired. The impact was brutal. A sickening thud echoed in the clearing. Pain, absolute and blinding, exploded in Jin Yue's shoulder. The force of the heavy bolt threw them both to the muddy ground. Jin Yue. The sound of Tian Ze's voice was something out of a nightmare. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Jin Yue lay in the mud, gasping for air. His vision was swimming. Blood, hot and fast, soaked through his hunting robes. Tian Ze scrambled to him, his hands covered in mud and blood. The stoic, untouchable commander was shaking violently. No, 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 Tian Ze chanted, pressing his hands desperately over the wound to stop the bleeding. Stay awake. Look at me, Jin Yue. Look at me! The remaining assassins hesitated, realizing they had just shot a royal prince. That hesitation cost them their lives. Tian Ze let out a sound that wasn't human. It was the roar of a wounded beast. He grabbed his sword, and in less than a minute, the clearing was silent. He slaughtered them all without mercy. When Tian Ze dropped to his knees, back beside Jin Yue, the commander's face was splattered with blood, his eyes wide and panicked. Jin Yue smiled weakly, reaching up with a trembling, bloody hand to touch Tian Ze's cheek. You're safe, Jin Yue whispered. You idiot, Tian Ze choked out, his tears mixing with the blood and mud on his face. You absolute reckless fool. Why did you do that? Why? Couldn't let you die. Not again. Jin Yue's eyes rolled back, and he passed out in Tian Ze's arms. When Jin Yue finally woke up, the smell of medicinal herbs was overpowering. He was in his own bed in the palace. The room was warm, the fireplace crackling. He turned his head slowly. The pain in his shoulder throbbed, but it was bandaged tightly. Sitting on the floor beside the bed, leaning heavily against the mattress, was Tian Ze. He wasn't wearing his armor. He was in simple black inner robes, his hair loose, dark circles under his eyes. He looked exhausted. He looked broken. Jin Yue shifted slightly, letting out a small hiss of pain. Tian Ze's head snapped up. He stood so quickly he nearly knocked over a bowl of water. You're awake, Tian Ze breathed. I'm alive, Jin Yue corrected softly. Tian Ze didn't bow. He didn't observe proper etiquette. He sat gently on the edge of the bed, his large hands hovering over Jin Yue, afraid to touch him, afraid to break him. You were asleep for 4 days, Tian Ze said, his voice raw. The imperial physician said the bolt missed your heart by an inch. I suppose I'm lucky. Tian Ze's hands clenched into fists. Why did you say that? Jin Yue paused. Say what? In the forest. Before you lost consciousness, you said, not again. What did you mean, Jin Yue? The room was painfully quiet. Jin Yue looked at the man he loved. He looked at the exhaustion, the devotion, the desperate need for truth in Tian Ze's eyes. He couldn't lie anymore. He was tired of carrying 2 lifetimes of secrets. I had a dream, Jin Yue started slowly. His voice trembled. A very long, very terrible dream. In that dream, I became emperor, and I was weak. I let the court control me. And they told me that you were going to betray me. Tian Ze remained perfectly still, listening. Tears welled in Jin Yue's eyes. I was so scared. I was so stupid. I gave you a cup of poisoned wine, and you drank it. You smiled at me, and you drank it. And then I lost everything. I died in a fire, alone, regretting it every single day. Jin Yue let out a choked sob, the guilt finally breaking through his carefully constructed walls. When I woke up, I was back here. 5 years in the past, and I promised myself. I swore to the heavens, I would never let anyone hurt you again, even if I had to die to protect you. The tears spilled over, running down Jin Yue's pale cheeks. He waited for Tian Ze to call him crazy. He waited for the commander to pull away in disgust. Instead, Tian Ze leaned down. He wrapped his strong arms gently around Jin Yue's uninjured side, pulling the prince into his broad chest. He buried his face in Jin Yue's hair. It was just a dream, Tian Ze whispered fiercely, his own voice cracking. It wasn't real. I am right here. I am perfectly fine. But I hurt you. You saved me, Tian Ze interrupted, pulling back just enough to look Jin Yue directly in the eyes. You took an arrow for me. You defied the crown prince for me. You treated a lowly guard like a king. If that was your past, then let it burn. In this life, you are my master, my prince, and my heart. Jin Yue's breath hitched. Tian Ze reached up, his rough thumb gently wiping the tears from Jin Yue's cheeks. I have loved you since the day you ran onto that training field barefoot, Tian Ze confessed, his voice dropping into a sensual, heavy whisper. I have loved you every night I sat by your bed. I will love you until my last breath. Jin Yue let out a soft gasp. He reached up with his good arm, gripping the back of Tian Ze's neck, and pulled him down. Their lips met. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, bruising, fueled by years of repressed longing, guilt, and sheer relief. Tian Ze's large hand cupped the back of Jin Yue's head, holding him steady, taking control. He kissed the prince deeply, pouring every ounce of his silent devotion into it, tasting the salt of Jin Yue's tears. Jin Yue whimpered, opening his mouth, letting Tian Ze map every inch of him. The heat between them flared dangerously, a slow-burn tension finally, spectacularly igniting in the quiet sanctuary of the bedroom. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. We cannot stay here, Jinyue whispered against his lips. I know, Tian Ze murmured, stroking Jinyue's hair. The crown prince sent those assassins. The emperor knows, but he will cover it up to protect the heir. I don't want the throne, Jinyue said fiercely. I never did. It only brings blood and ash. I just want you. Tian Ze smiled. It was a real breathtaking smile, the kind that made his sharp features look devastatingly handsome. Then we will leave, Tian Ze promised. The plan was enacted 3 months later. During the winter solstice, a massive fire broke out in the cold palace. The flames consumed the 7th prince's quarters entirely. By the time the royal guards put out the fire, they found 2 unidentifiable bodies burned beyond recognition. The palace mourned briefly. The crown prince secretly celebrated. The 7th prince and his loyal shadow guard were recorded in the imperial archives as victims of a tragic accident. They were dead to the empire. But hundreds of miles away, in a quiet, wealthy merchant town in the warm southern province, a young nobleman in pristine blue silk sat by a lake, sipping tea. The sun shone brightly. The air smelled of jasmine, not stale incense. Footsteps approached from behind. Heavy, steady, familiar. A tall man dressed in dark civilian clothes, bearing no sword but carrying an aura of absolute protection, walked up to the table. He carried a fresh plate of sweet pastries. Jinyue looked up and smiled. His eyes were bright, completely free of the shadows that had haunted him for 2 lifetimes. You took a long time at the market, Tian Ze. Tian Ze set the plate down, then leaned over, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the crown of Jinyue's head. The baker was slow. And I know how much my husband hates waiting. Jinyue's heart fluttered. Husband. It still felt like a dream, but this time, it was a dream he never had to wake up from. He reached out, intertwining his fingers with Tian Ze's. The hands that had once held a poisoned cup now held onto a beautiful, unbreakable future. And for the rest of their long, peaceful lives, neither of them ever looked back. If you want the next part, the uncensored continuation, and more unlimited 18+ ancient royal BL stories, come join Spicy Ancient BL on Patreon. The link is waiting for you in the description and pinned comment.